Greetings. So, if you look in some of the older videos that I have posted, a lot of the stories that I've been working on, I have already read through at various stages. And since I'm a insatiable reviser, a lot of times that these newer versions come up to where they have something in common with the previous reading, but they do change and alter. And this this short novel is complete. I mean, for all intents and purposes, it is complete. There's some little revisions here and there, but some clarifications because the outcome of the novel has three possibilities, and I'm not going to state which of the possibilities there are to create the potential for one to decide what possibility it could be. Because any one of the three possibilities could be. They could be exactly what goes on. So I leave that hanging. There's, I don't know what it's. I don't see the need to explain everything. That's one of the things that bothers me about modern films, is that the insatiable desire to explain every detail. And sometimes the most important details are the ones that you exclude from the story. But this would also require the viewer or the consumer of the story to be invested in that story to such a degree that they're integrated into the story, that the thing that's not being said in the story can infest their brain. Because one of the things I think people seem to overlook with modern storytelling is it's not necessarily the plot or the characters. These are inseparable from a good story. But one of the most important things in storytelling is getting into a state of mind. And this is probably one of the biggest bugaboos I have about things like modern art. That modern art, abstract art, modernist art, contemporary art finds itself to be so isolated from the context of the world as a whole that it's difficult to get into the mindset of the person who's creating it. Because that's part of the relationship between the person who's consuming the piece of creative media, a novel, short story, comic, painting, a movie, piece of music. And music, since it's such an immediate form, this isn't such a big issue. But things like novels, which require a massive amount of abstraction on behalf of the consumer, because they have to generate the image in their mind. That getting into the mindset of the author is of the utmost importance. And once you succeed in doing that, that kind of connection between the reader and the author, then you begin to understand where the author is going with the story enough to where the author doesn't necessarily have to serve it on a silver platter to make it obvious. That's why the three possibilities in this story, why I'm not intending to expose which one it is. And it's not because it's the responsibility of the reader to presume which of the three is the accurate one, but that in some ways your decision into which one of the three solutions or reasons might say something about who you are as a person. And it's not the responsibility of a piece of written work to expose that, but it's part of the charm in good writing. Because, again, you're getting into the mindset of the author, figuring out what they're thinking, where they're going. And a lot of times, and this is one of the issues I have with exposition in movies, because you have to keep in mind the film is a visual medium, first and foremost. And that because it's that way, then it is better to tell the story first in the visual way, and then to use music to set the mood, and then the verbal cues, the dialogue, as a supplement, because it is first and foremost a visual means of communication. And it's inappropriate, I think, to use exposition to make up the shortfall of poor visual storytelling. I don't have it. The author of this, Atlas Shrugged. Atlas Shrugged. It's a good book. It's not Rand's best, but it's not a bad book. And when people come across the book, I always tell them there's a 60-page monologue that it's been my conclusion, as a person who's been writing since he's 15 years old. You get a sense that having a 60-page monologue in the middle of a novel seems kind of unnecessary. Again, it's about exposition. And the author is always talking about how the ideas of the characters and the ideas of the author should be fully integrated into the story. If that was the case, then a 60-page monologue would be kind of unnecessary. Because to have that level of exposition in the middle of a novel would suggest that maybe the integration of the ideas of the author and the story itself isn't complete. So that's why I would say Anthem and The Fountainhead is a superior piece of written art than Atlas Shrugged. Just my opinion. But again, the novel succeeds because it gets the reader into the mindset, into the realm of thinking. And I guess you could call it sense of life or an artistic philosophy. But this would be the doorway into understanding and getting a piece of art. Whether it's a movie or if it's a novel or a piece of music. Getting into the flow, I guess would be a better way of saying it. So, and probably that level of immersion that's necessary for good art. And it's one of those, it's a weird way, because usually you don't want to know the character or the behavior or the personality of the the creative force behind your favorite piece of artwork. What's the old phrase? You never want to know your heroes. But still, good artwork requires you to be integrated into the thought process of that person. And that's why you have someone like Crichton, or Robert Ludlum, where they succeed in creating these massive bestsellers because they're just rubber stamping. Basically, Stephen King would be another good example of this. They're rubber stamping a, you could call it an artistic algorithm, a formula of storytelling. And it's not necessarily that the stories repeat themselves, is that you are familiar with the getting into the mind of the writer to such a degree that it's like visiting a grandmother or an old friend. And I think that's more why these writers have always propagated continual repeated bestsellers, is because they're successful at replicating that mindset from one story to the next. And again, it's only a part, plot, characterization, the the tempo, themes, all that can be integrated along with the entry into the mind of the person who is doing the work. And realism can help, but it's not entirely necessary. And this is one of the interesting ways in which things like science fiction and surrealism and fantasy can succeed, because they're not associated so much with reality, but you still get into the mindset of the person who's doing the creative work. Mostly because there is some level of context that's still available. No matter how fantastical the story is, there's some level of human interaction within that story, somewhere, some connection with the real world that is pertinent, which gets you into that mindset. And again, this is my biggest beef with avant-garde trash. It's decorative. It might set a mood, but setting a mood and creating an entry into a mindset, it's a little different. So, anyway.